Picture this. A colossal shadow looming over an ordinary Indiana town. A creature so massive it dwarfs the tallest buildings. Its form twisted into something resembling a monstrous spider, with limbs that stretch impossibly far into storm clouds crackling with crimson lightning. This is no ordinary monster. This is the Mind Flayer, an entity that represents something far more terrifying than teeth and claws. It represents the complete obliteration of self, the loss of everything that makes you human, absorbed into a consciousness so vast and alien that individual thought becomes nothing more than a whisper lost in a hurricane. The Mind Flayer stands as one of the most complex and chilling antagonists to emerge from the world of Hawkins. A being that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, physical and psychological, immediate and existential. Unlike creatures that simply hunt and kill, the Mind Flayer seeks to assimilate, to corrupt, to transform the very fabric of reality itself. It doesn't just want to destroy humanity. It wants to remake the world in its own twisted image. And for years, the residents of Hawkins had no idea that every horror they faced, every creature that emerged from the darkness, was merely an extension of this singular, malevolent intelligence. Understanding the Mind Flayer means understanding the very heart of the conflict that has consumed Hawkins since that fateful night in November of 1983. It means tracing the connections between a scared boy hiding in an alternate dimension, a troubled teenager fighting for redemption, and a man who sought to become something more than human and succeeded in the most horrific way imaginable. The story of the Mind Flayer is ultimately the story of power, control, and what happens when someone decides that humanity itself is a mistake that needs to be corrected. The creature's name comes from a monster in Dungeons and Dragons, a game that has served as the framework for understanding the impossible throughout the series. In that game, Mind Flayers are terrifying beings that feed on brains and enslave entire civilizations through psychic domination. The kids who first witnessed the shadow in the sky chose this name because it captured something essential about what they were facing. This wasn't just a predator. This was something that could reach inside your mind, twist your thoughts, and make you a prisoner in your own body while it used you for its own purposes. But before we can understand what the Mind Flayer became, we need to understand where it came from. And that story begins not in the Upside Down, but in a small house in Hawkins, Indiana, in the year 1959, with a boy who was far more dangerous than anyone around him could have possibly imagined. Henry Creel arrived in Hawkins with his family in the spring of 1959. His father Victor, a World War II veteran, had inherited money from his wife's relative, enough to purchase a Taove, beautiful old house, and start fresh in this quiet Midwestern town. They were running from something, though Victor wouldn't have put it in those terms. His son was troubled, sensitive, different in ways that teachers and doctors couldn't explain. Henry didn't fit in with other children. He experienced the world in a way that others found deeply unsettling, and his parents hoped that a change of scenery, a fresh start in a new place, might somehow fix whatever was wrong with their son. They had no idea that Henry was experiencing something extraordinary and terrible. The exact origin of Henry's abilities remains somewhat unclear, with different accounts offering varying explanations. According to some versions of events, Henry was accidentally transported to another dimension for 12 hours, a place that would later be known as Dimension X, and this exposure fundamentally changed him. However, other accounts suggest the connection between Henry and that dimension may have been more complex, with the entities there possibly influencing him even before any physical journey occurred. What we know for certain is that Henry developed abilities no human should possess, powers that allowed him to see into the minds of others, to move objects with thought alone, to reach across the barrier between the physical and the mental and reshape reality according to his will. These powers terrified the people around Henry, but they didn't terrify him. They made him feel special, chosen, like he had finally found his purpose in a world that had never made sense to him. Henry began to experiment with his abilities, first on animals, then on the people closest to him. He could see into his parents' minds, could witness their memories, their traumas, their secrets. His father's experiences in the war, the violence he had committed and witnessed. His mother's hidden fears and disappointments. These glimpses into the darkest corners of human consciousness didn't make Henry sympathetic to their struggles. Instead, they filled him with contempt. Henry developed a philosophy, a worldview that would define everything that came after. He believed that humanity was fundamentally flawed, a species that had disrupted the natural order of the world. He saw people as pests, multiplying endlessly, destroying everything they touched, enforcing cruel and artificial structures on a world that had been perfect before they arrived. He found inspiration in an unlikely place: black widow spiders, creatures that preyed on their own kind to maintain balance. In Henry's mind, humans needed a predator, something to cull their numbers and restore the natural order. And since no such predator existed, Henry decided he would have to become that predator himself. On March 14th, 1959, Henry Creel used his powers to torture and murder his mother and sister. He tried to kill his father too, but Victor survived, though his mind was shattered by the experience. The authorities arrested Victor, believing he was responsible for the murders. No one suspected the quiet, troubled boy who had somehow escaped the carnage. No one except Dr. Martin Brenner. Brenner was a scientist who worked for the government, a man obsessed with psychic phenomena and the potential military applications of the human mind. When he heard about the impossible deaths at the Creel house, he recognized what others had missed. He took Henry from the hospital where the boy was being observed, brought him to Hawkins National Laboratory, and designated him Subject 001. Henry became the first test subject in a program that would eventually include other numbered children with similar abilities, though none would ever be as powerful as the original. For years, Brenner studied Henry, trying to understand and control his abilities. He implanted a device called soteria into Henry's neck, a chip that suppressed his powers and kept him docile. But Brenner couldn't control Henry forever. In 1979, Henry convinced another test subject, a young girl designated 011 but known as 11, to remove the soteria device. Once freed from its influence, Henry unleashed the full extent of his power. He massacred nearly everyone in the laboratory, killing his fellow test subjects, the guards, the scientists, everyone except 11 herself. Henry tried to convince 11 to join him, to help him reshape the world and destroy humanity. But 11 refused. In the confrontation that followed, 11 proved to be strong enough to defeat Henry, though she couldn't kill him. Instead, she opened a gateway to another dimension and banished him through it. Henry fell through space and time, through a tear in reality itself, tumbling into an alien world that would become his kingdom and his prison. The dimension Henry discovered was unlike anything that existed in the known universe. This was Dimension X, the same realm he had briefly visited as a child, but now he was seeing it in its full, terrifying glory. It was a place unspoiled by human interference, a realm of floating rocks and perpetual twilight, where strange creatures wandered through landscapes that defied conventional physics. There were demogorgons here, predatory beasts with no eyes and mouths that opened like horrible flowers, creatures that had evolved in this harsh environment to become perfect hunters. But the most extraordinary thing Henry found was a massive storm of particles, a swirling cloud of dark matter that moved with what seemed like intelligence or perhaps instinct. The nature of this entity remains one of the great mysteries of the story. Was it sentient before Henry found it? Did it have its own goals and desires? Or was it simply raw potential waiting for someone to give it shape and purpose? Different accounts provide different answers, and the truth may be far more complex than any single explanation can capture. What we know for certain is that Henry saw an opportunity in that cloud of particles. He reached out with his psychic abilities and made contact with the entity. Using the full extent of his powers that had been amplified by whatever happened to him during his fall through dimensions, Henry began to reshape the cloud. He moulded it, formed it, gave it structure and purpose. Drawing on memories from his childhood, particularly his fascination with black widow spiders, Henry transformed the formless mass into something with a definite shape, a gigantic spider-like creature with a distinctive flame-shaped head. This was the birth of the Mind Flayer, though it would be years before anyone in Hawkins would learn that name. Henry had created something that allowed him to transcend the limitations of his human form. Through the Mind Flayer, he could extend his consciousness across vast distances, could reach into multiple minds simultaneously, could command entire armies of creatures with a single thought. The Mind Flayer became the physical manifestation of Henry's will, the tool through which he would achieve his goal of destroying humanity and remaking the world. But calling the Mind Flayer simply a tool doesn't quite capture the complexity of what Henry created. The entity possesses a kind of intelligence that seems to go beyond simple obedience to Henry's commands. It has its own presence, its own terrible majesty. When people encounter it, they don't just sense Henry. They sense something older, darker, more fundamentally alien than any human consciousness could ever be. The relationship between Henry Creel, who had become known as Vecna, and the Mind Flayer he created remains ambiguous. Who truly controls whom? Is the Mind Flayer nothing more than an extension of Vecna's will, or has it developed into something more independent, something that might have its own agenda? This question becomes even more complicated when we consider accounts that suggest the Mind Flayer may have been influencing Henry even before he shaped it. The stage play The First Shadow, which serves as canonical backstory, indicates that during Henry's childhood, the entity from Dimension X was already exerting some degree of control over him, pushing him toward violence, potentially using him as a vessel even before he consciously moulded it into the form we recognize. If accurate, this creates a fascinating paradox, a loop in time and causality that defies easy explanation. The question of whether Henry created the Mind Flayer or the Mind Flayer created Henry becomes impossible to answer definitively. What we're left with suggests they may be so intertwined that the distinction between them has become meaningless. Regardless of these philosophical questions, the practical reality is clear. The Mind Flayer represents a massive, terrifying intelligence that commands everything within the Upside Down. And the way it maintains that command is through one of the most horrifying concepts in the entire story, the hive mind. The hive mind is what makes the mind, the Flayer, truly unstoppable. Imagine a consciousness so vast that it can inhabit multiple bodies simultaneously, controlling them all like puppets while maintaining perfect awareness of everything each puppet sees and experiences. The Mind Flayer doesn't just command its servants, it becomes them, looking through their eyes, thinking through their minds, using their bodies as extensions of its own will. Every demogorgon, every vine that snakes through the Upside Down, every creature that emerges from that dark dimension is connected to the Mind Flayer through this psychic network. This connection operates on a level far beyond normal communication. It's not like the Mind Flayer is sending instructions that its minions then carry out. The relationship is far more intimate and disturbing than that. The hive mind means that the Mind Flayer is simultaneously existing in multiple places at once. When a Demogorgon hunts, the Mind Flayer hunts. When vines spread through tunnels beneath Hawkins, the Mind Flayer spreads. There is no separation between the controller and the controlled. They are all part of the same vast organism, a single entity distributed across countless individual forms. The mechanics of how this works involve the particles that make up the Mind Flayer's form. These particles can detach from the main body and infiltrate other beings, establishing a connection that allows the Mind Flayer to access their thoughts and control their actions. Once someone or something becomes part of the hive mind, they lose their individual autonomy. Their desires become subordinate to the Mind Flayer's desires. Their memories become accessible to the Mind Flayer's awareness. They become, in effect, organs of a larger body, serving a function they may not even understand. But the hive mind has weaknesses, and these weaknesses would prove crucial in humanity's fight against the Mind Flayer. The connection between the Mind Flayer and its servants depends on the gateway between dimensions remaining open. When that gateway closes, the psychic link is severed, and the creatures under the Mind Flayer's control are cut off from its influence. For creatures like Demogorgons and Demodogs, this severance is fatal. Their minds are so thoroughly integrated into the hive that losing the connection kills them instantly, their bodies shutting down as if a vital organ has been removed. This weakness manifested dramatically in 1984 when 11 closed the gate beneath Hawkins' lab. The pack of Demodogs that had been attacking the facility, acting with coordinated intelligence that came from the hive mind, suddenly dropped dead. Every single one of them died at the exact same moment, the instant the psychic link was broken. Even Dart, the Demodog that Dustin had befriended and who had shown signs of individual personality and affection, couldn't survive the severance. The hive mind wasn't just controlling these creatures, it was sustaining them, providing some essential function that their individual bodies couldn't perform on their own. Without it, they simply ceased to exist as living beings. The hive mind also has another significant weakness: heat. The Mind Flayer exists in a dimension of cold and darkness, and it has adapted to thrive in those conditions. Its particles operate best at low temperatures, which is why possessed individuals like Will constantly wanted their environment to be freezing. Extreme heat disrupts the particles that make up its form, causing them pain and forcing them to retreat. The particles can't maintain their cohesion in high temperatures, and the connections between them start to break down. This vulnerability would become a key strategy in fighting the Mind Flayer's influence, particularly when it came to freeing humans who had been possessed by the entity. Joyce Byers understood this instinctively when she recognized Will's constant complaints about being too warm, when he wanted to keep the house cold even as winter approached. Heat was the enemy of the Mind Flayer, and by extension, heat became one of humanity's most effective weapons against it. Speaking of possession, no discussion of the Mind Flayer would be complete without examining its most personal and devastating attacks, the moments when it reached into the human world and took control of living people. And the first victim of this particular horror was a boy who had already suffered more than any child should have to endure. Will Byers was 12 years old when he disappeared on November 6, 1983. He was riding his bike home from a game of Dungeons and Dragons with his friends when something emerged from the woods near Hawkins' laboratory. A Demogorgon, hunting in the human world for the first time since the gateway had opened, found Will on that dark road and dragged him into the Upside Down. The Demogorgon's targeting of Will raises questions that connect to the larger mystery of the Mind Flayer's influence. Every other victim the Demogorgon encountered was killed immediately and brutally. Barbara Holland, dragged into the Upside Down the same week, was killed within hours. Scientists at the lab were torn apart, but Will survived for a full week in that hostile dimension, hiding, evading, somehow staying alive despite being a small child in an environment toxic to human life. Looking back with our current understanding of the hive mind, this seems less like luck and more like intent. Was the Demogorgon acting purely on instinct, or was there already a consciousness behind its actions, preserving Will for some purpose we still don't fully understand? Will spent that week communicating with his mother through flickering lights and Christmas bulbs, proving that even in the darkest place imaginable, a child's love for his mother could create a connection strong enough to span dimensions. He hid in Castle Byers, the fort he had built in his backyard, which somehow existed in both dimensions. He sang songs to himself to keep away the fear. He was resourceful and brave in ways that defied his age and circumstances. His friends and family rescued Will, but the ordeal left marks that went far beyond physical trauma. Will had been exposed to the Upside Down in ways that no other human had experienced. He had breathed its air, touched its surfaces, been pursued through its twisted landscape. When he returned to the human world, he brought something back with him, a connection to that other place that wouldn't simply vanish just because he was home. For a year after his rescue, Will experienced what doctors called post-traumatic stress disorder. He would have visions of the Upside Down, brief moments when he seemed to slip back into that dimension even though his body remained in Hawkins. In these visions, he saw a massive shadow in the sky, a creature that dwarfed everything around it. The visions terrified Will, but he tried to be brave about them. His mother's new boyfriend, Bob, a kind man who meant well, told Will that the best way to deal with nightmares was to stand up to them, to tell them to go away. On October 29th, 1984, Will tried to follow Bob's advice. During one of his visions, instead of running from the shadow creature, he stood his ground and shouted at it to leave him alone. This was exactly what the Mind Flayer had been waiting for. The moment Will confronted it, the Mind Flayer reached across dimensions and took hold of him. A tendril of shadow descended from the sky, wrapped around Will's consciousness, and pulled him into its embrace. Will collapsed in the real world, and when he woke up, he was no longer alone inside his own mind. The possession of Will Byers was different from anything the Mind Flayer would attempt later. This was its first time directly inhabiting a human being, and it approached the task with a kind of terrible curiosity, learning how human minds worked, testing the limits of its control. Will remained conscious for much of the possession, trapped inside his own body while the Mind Flayer puppeted him. He could feel its presence, cold and vast and utterly alien, pressing down on his thoughts like a weight that threatened to crush his identity entirely. The physical symptoms were immediate and disturbing. Will's body temperature dropped significantly, making him constantly cold despite the normal warmth of his surroundings. He insisted on keeping windows open even in late October, demanded that the house remain frigid. His eyes would sometimes change colour when the Mind Flayer's influence was strongest, turning from their normal brown to an unsettling shade that reflected the entity within. He would have episodes where he seemed to completely leave his body, staring into nothing while the Mind Flayer used his eyes to observe the world around him. But the psychological violation was even worse. Will could feel the Mind Flayer's thoughts mixing with his own, alien concepts and desires bleeding into his consciousness. The entity wanted cold, wanted darkness, wanted to spread and consume. It looked at Will's friends and family not with Will's love, but with the predatory assessment of a hunter evaluating prey. Will had to fight constantly to maintain any sense of who he was, to hold on to the memories and emotions that defined him as a person, separate from the vast consciousness that had invaded him. The Mind Flayer used Will's connection to Hawkins to spy on the people fighting against it. It looked through Will's eyes, listened through his ears, and learned everything it needed to know about its enemies. It discovered the layout of Hawkins' lab, the locations of the tunnels beneath the town, the strengths and weaknesses of everyone trying to stop it. When Will drew endless pictures of the tunnel system, covering sheet after sheet of paper with frantic sketches, he wasn't creating art. He was mapping out the Mind Flayer's domain, providing the entity with a way to navigate the network of growth it had established beneath Hawkins. The most revealing and horrifying moment came when scientists at Hawkins' laboratory started burning the tunnels beneath the town, trying to destroy the network of growth that the Mind Flayer had established. The moment the flames touched those alien vines, Will screamed. He collapsed, writhing in agony, feeling every moment of pain as if his own body was being set on fire. The Mind Flayer and the tunnels were connected through the hive mind, and Will was now part of that connection. His agony was genuine, and it revealed something terrifying. The entity didn't distinguish between its various parts. Burning the tunnels was the same as burning Will himself. There was no separation in the hive mind's perception. Every piece was the whole, and the whole felt everything done to any piece. But Will Byers was stronger than the Mind Flayer anticipated. Even while possessed, even while the creature controlled his actions and filtered his perceptions, a part of Will remained untouched, hidden away in some corner of his consciousness where the Mind Flayer couldn't quite reach. When his friends and family questioned him, trying to find a way to help him, Will found a way to communicate. He tapped out a message in Morse code, a technique he had learned from Bob, spelling out a desperate plea for them to close the gate, to sever the connection between dimensions, even though doing so might kill Will in the process. His family chose a different approach. They remembered that Will had mentioned the Mind Flayer liked it cold, that it made him want to keep his environment freezing. Heat was the key. Joyce Byers, Will's mother, along with his brother Jonathan and family friend Nancy Wheeler, took Will to Hopper's cabin and strapped him to a chair. They surrounded him with space heaters, gradually raising the temperature until Will's body became uninhabitable for the Mind Flayer's particles. It was an exorcism conducted with heat instead of holy water, and it worked. The shadow fled from Will's body, streaming out of his mouth in a cloud of black vapour that escaped into the night sky. Will was free, but the experience left him fundamentally changed. He had been violated in a way that most people couldn't comprehend. His very self invaded and suppressed. He had felt the Mind Flayer's thoughts, understood its alien perspective, been forced to see the world through its eyes. Even after the possession ended, Will retained a connection to the Mind Flayer. He could sense when it was active, could feel its presence at the edge of his awareness like a cold wind on the back of his neck. This connection would never fully go away. The Mind Flayer had marked Will Byers, and that mark would remain with him for the rest of his life. But Will's ordeal was only the beginning. The Mind Flayer learned from its experience with him, understood the mistakes it had made, the ways Will had resisted. And when the gateway between dimensions opened again in the summer of 1985, the Mind Flayer was ready to try something new, something far more ambitious and terrifying than a single possessed child. When Will's possession ended and the gate beneath Hawkins was sealed, the fragment of the Mind Flayer that had entered Will's body didn't simply disappear. It couldn't return to the Upside Down with the gateway closed, so it did the only thing it could do. It found a place to hide. The shadow particles flew to an abandoned steel mill on the outskirts of town, a place called Brimborn Steel Works, and there they settled, dormant but not dead, waiting for their opportunity. That opportunity came in the summer of 1985 when a group of Russian scientists working in a secret facility beneath the new Star Court Mall successfully reopened a gateway to the Upside Down. The moment that new portal stabilized, the dormant fragment of the Mind Flayer awakened. The psychic connection was re-established, and suddenly the Mind Flayer had a presence in Hawkins again, a small piece of itself that could act independently while still remaining connected to the hive mind in the Upside Down. The Mind Flayer had learned from its failure with Will Byers. This time, it wouldn't try to possess someone while maintaining their consciousness. This time, it would take over completely, transforming its hosts into extensions of itself with almost no trace of their original personality remaining. And it would start small, with creatures that no one would notice until it was too late. Rats. The Mind Flayer began by possessing dozens, then hundreds of rats throughout Hawkins. These weren't random attacks. The entity chose rats because they were numerous, unnoticed, and could move through the town without drawing attention. These rats lost all normal animal behaviour, becoming completely subservient to the Mind Flayer's will. They stopped foraging for food, in the traditional sense, stopped exhibiting fear of humans or cats, stopped doing anything that normal rats would do to survive. They had one purpose now, the purpose given to them by the hive mind. The entity forced them to consume chemicals, fertilizers, and cleaning products and other toxic substances that no animal would normally eat. Mrs. Doris Driscoll, an elderly woman who lived alone, noticed rats getting into her fertilizer and called an exterminator, not realizing she was witnessing the first stage of an invasion far more terrible than any normal rat infestation. The chemicals the rats consumed weren't food for them in any traditional sense. They were catalysts, triggering some kind of biochemical reaction that the Mind Flayer needed to transform living tissue into something it could use. Then the rats gathered at the steel mill, where the Mind Flayer initiated the next horrific phase of its plan. One by one, the rats' bodies began to dissolve, melting down into puddles of biomass that steamed and bubbled with unnatural life. The flesh and bone broke down into a viscous organic material that the Mind Flayer could reshape and combine. The entity was building itself a new body, constructing a physical form in the human world, one sacrificed rat at a time. The biomass would flow together, merge, begin to take on structure and purpose. It was grotesque and fascinating, a demonstration of the Mind Flayer's ability to manipulate organic matter on a fundamental level. But rats alone wouldn't be enough for what the Mind Flayer intended. It needed something larger, stronger, more capable. It needed a human host who could move freely through Hawkins society, who could gather more victims and expand the hive mind's influence. On June 29th, 1985, the Mind Flayer found exactly what it was looking for. Billy Hargrove was driving down Cherry Oak Drive when something forced him off the road. His car crashed near the steel mill, and when Billy got out to investigate, a tendril of the biomass creature that the Mind Flayer had been building erupted from the darkness and dragged him into the mill's basement. There, the flesh monster pumped something into Billy's face, a toxic substance that carried the Mind Flayer's particles directly into his body and brain. Billy fought, screamed, tried to resist, but it was useless. Within minutes, the transformation was complete. Billy Hargrove became the first human member of the Flayed, and through him, the Mind Flayer would build an army. Billy's possession was fundamentally different from what had happened to Will. Where Will had maintained some ability to resist, some core of self that the Mind Flayer couldn't fully suppress, Billy seemed to lose that battle almost immediately. The Mind Flayer didn't just control Billy's actions, it rewrote his personality, turning him into something cold and predatory that wore Billy's face like a mask. But beneath that mask, in moments when the Mind Flayer's control wavered, hints of the real Billy remained. He was terrified, trapped inside his own body, forced to watch as the entity used him to hurt people he cared about. The reasons Billy became such an effective host for the Mind Flayer are complex and tragic, revealing layers of psychological vulnerability that the entity expertly exploited. Billy had spent his entire life being abused by his father Neil, subjected to violence and cruelty that taught him he was worthless, that fighting back was pointless, that he deserved whatever pain came his way. Neil had beaten Billy's mother so severely that she eventually left, abandoning Billy to his father's rage. From that point forward, Billy became the primary target of Neil's violence. The abuse was both physical and psychological, with Neil using homophobic slurs and belittling his son at every opportunity, systematically breaking down any sense of self-worth Billy might have developed. This history of trauma made Billy psychologically vulnerable in ways that Will, who had loving family and friends supporting him, was not. Where Will had people who constantly reminded him of his value, who fought to reach him even when he was trapped, Billy had spent years learning that no one would come to save him, that his suffering was inevitable and deserved. The Mind Flayer, at its core, operates like an abuser, and it recognized in Billy someone who had already been broken by abuse, someone who had learned helplessness so thoroughly that resistance seemed impossible. The contrast between Will's and Billy's possessions reveals something important about how the Mind Flayer adapts its approach. With Will, the entity had to constantly suppress the boy's resistance, had to fight against the part of Will that knew he was loved and valued. But with Billy, the Mind Flayer found someone who had already internalized the belief that he deserved to suffer, that he was meant to be controlled and used. Billy's psyche had been primed for this kind of domination by years of his father's abuse. There were moments, brief flashes when the Mind Flayer's control loosened, when Billy's true self surfaced and revealed the horror of his situation. At the community pool, when Karen Wheeler approached him and the Mind Flayer urged him to attack her, to make her another victim, Billy managed to resist. He warned her to stay away from him, showing that somewhere beneath the possession, the real Billy recognized what was happening and was trying to protect someone he cared about. In the sauna, when the heat weakened the Mind Flayer's grip, Billy broke down in tears, apologizing to Max for what he had become, for what the entity was making him do. These moments of clarity were torture for Billy, glimpses of freedom immediately followed by the Mind Flayer reasserting total control. Through Billy, the Mind Flayer expanded its influence methodically and strategically. Billy's first victim was Heather Holloway, his co-worker at the community pool. He lured her to the steel mill under false pretenses, and the Mind Flayer claimed her just as it had claimed him. Heather then helped Billy bring in more victims, her parents, Tom and Janet Holloway, who were subdued and possessed. Each new member of the Flayed brought in others, creating an exponential expansion of the hive mind's presence in Hawkins. The possessed humans, the Flayed, retained enough of their original behaviour to move through society without immediate detection, but they were fundamentally changed in ways that became more obvious upon close observation. They consumed chemicals constantly, their bodies undergoing some kind of transformation that the Mind Flayer required. Tom and Janet Holloway were seen guzzling bottles of cleaning products. Doris Driscoll ate handfuls of fertilizer despite her friend's horror. The chemical consumption seemed to serve the same purpose it had with the rats, preparing the bodies for eventual dissolution and incorporation into the Mind Flayer's biomass form. The Flayed also developed a powerful psychological compulsion to gather at the steel mill, as if the place itself had become the centre of a web they couldn't escape. Doris Driscoll, when taken to the hospital and separated from Brimborn Steelworks, became agitated and distressed, exhibiting symptoms similar to severe withdrawal. She needed to return to that place, felt an overwhelming pull toward it that she couldn't explain or resist. The steel mill had become a kind of nest for the Mind Flayer, a focal point where its presence in the human world was strongest. The flayed worked together with an eerie coordination that came from their shared connection to the hive mind. They didn't need to communicate verbally or plan their actions. The Mind Flayer directed them all simultaneously, like a conductor leading an orchestra. Billy would lure victims to the steel mill. Heather would help subdue them. The biomass creature would inject them with the Mind Flayer's particles. Each new member of the flayed brought in others, creating an exponential expansion of the hive mind's presence in Hawkins. Family members brought in family members, co-workers brought in co-workers, and the infection spread through social connections, exploiting the very relationships that normally would protect people. And when the Mind Flayer decided they had served their purpose, when it was time to construct its ultimate physical form, the flayed received a final, horrible command. They gathered at the steel mill in the dozens, standing in patient rows like soldiers awaiting orders. Then their bodies began to melt. The transformation was agonizing, but irreversible. The flayed dissolved into the same biomass that had been created from the rats, adding their mass to the growing creature the Mind Flayer was constructing. Dozens of people, their individual identities erased, their bodies reduced to organic material that the Mind Flayer shaped according to its needs, their very selves sacrificed to build a monster. The monster that emerged from this grotesque process was massive, a spider-like creature made of bone and muscle and blood, an avatar of the Mind Flayer's will in the physical world. This flesh monster appeared to be specifically created to counter 11, the one person in Hawkins with the power to genuinely threaten the Mind Flayer's plans. When the creature bit 11 during a confrontation at the Hopper cabin, it left a piece of itself inside her leg. This fragment began to absorb her powers, draining them away, ensuring that even if 11 survived the immediate encounter, she would be powerless to stop what came next. The possessed Billy even stated the creature was made for her, suggesting the Mind Flayer had learned from every previous confrontation and adapted its strategy to account for every weapon its enemies might deploy against it. The entity was playing a long game, thinking several moves ahead, and it seemed impossible to stop. Throughout all of this, Billy remained the Mind Flayer's primary agent, its general in the war against Hawkins. He coordinated the flayed, led them in their missions, and served as the monster's eyes and voice in the human world. But he was also suffering in ways that most people around him couldn't perceive. In the rare moments when the Mind Flayer's control loosened, when Billy's true self surfaced, he was horrified by what he had become. He tried to warn people away from him, tried to resist the commands he was receiving, but the Mind Flayer's grip was too strong. Billy was a prisoner, and there seemed to be no escape. The confrontation between the Mind Flayer and the defenders of Hawkins reached its climax on July the 4th, 1985, at the Starcourt Mall. The timing wasn't coincidental. The 4th of July celebration meant the mall would be packed with people, providing the Mind Flayer with countless potential victims if it succeeded in its goals. The Russians' machine had opened a massive gateway beneath the mall, and the Mind Flayer was preparing for a final assault that would reshape the world forever. Its flesh monster had grown to enormous size, towering stories tall, its form a nightmare amalgamation of bone and muscle and sinew constructed from the dissolved bodies of the flayed. The creature had gathered every remaining member of the flayed to the mall for the ultimate confrontation. The creature's goal was simple and terrible: kill 11, eliminate the one person who had consistently thwarted its plans, and then begin the process of merging the Upside Down with the human world. With 11's powers already weakened by the fragment it had left in her leg, the Mind Flayer had positioned itself to finally win this war that had been raging since 1983. The battle was brutal and desperate, playing out on multiple fronts throughout the mall. The flesh monster pursued 11 and her friends through the corridors, its massive form demolishing everything in its path. It demonstrated incredible strength, tearing through concrete walls as if they were paper, shrugging off gunfire that would have killed any normal creature. When Steve, Robin, Dustin, and Erica tried to fight it with improvised weapons, the creature barely noticed their attacks. When Nancy and Jonathan shot at it, the bullet sank into its flesh and disappeared without slowing it down. The monster seemed almost impossible to stop, adapting to every strategy the kids threw at it. It could separate parts of itself to attack from multiple directions. It could reform damaged sections almost instantly. It moved with terrifying speed despite its massive size. The chase led through the mall's corridors, into stores, up escalators, creating a trail of destruction that would have been impossible to explain to authorities later. When it finally cornered 11 in the parking lot beneath the mall, when Billy dragged her before the monster's gaping maw, ready to deliver her to her doom, it seemed like the Mind Flayer had won. 11 was exhausted, powerless, unable to defend herself. Mike and the others were too far away to help. The monster's massive form loomed over her, tentacles poised to strike, ready to end the life of the person who had been a thorn in its side for years. But 11 had one weapon left, one strategy that the Mind Flayer hadn't anticipated because it fundamentally didn't understand what it was. She reached into Billy's mind, not with her powers, those were gone, but with empathy and compassion. She didn't attack him or try to control him. Instead, she reminded him of who he had been. She showed him memories of his mother, of a time before Neil's abuse had twisted him into something angry and broken. She showed him sunshine and waves, his mother's smile, the feeling of being loved and protected. She showed him that he had once been capable of love, of joy, of being something other than the monster his father had tried to make him. She appealed not to the part of Billy that the Mind Flayer controlled, but to the part it couldn't quite reach, the core of self that remained buried under all the trauma and possession. And Billy remembered, in that moment, faced with a choice between serving the Mind Flayer and protecting someone who had shown him genuine compassion, perhaps the first person to show him real kindness in years, Billy chose to fight back. The Mind Flayer's control was absolute, but Billy's will in that instant was stronger. He turned on the flesh monster, placing himself between it and 11, using his body as a shield. The Mind Flayer, enraged by this betrayal, drove tentacles through Billy's torso, impaling him again and again. Blood poured from multiple wounds. His body was shredded, broken, dying, but Billy stood firm, holding the monster back, keeping it away from 11 long enough for the others to act, buying precious seconds with his life. Below the mall, Joyce Byers and Jim Hopper had reached the Russian facility through a combination of luck, determination, and Hopper's willingness to do whatever it took to protect his town. They destroyed the machine that was keeping the gateway open, throwing the keys into the mechanism at the last possible moment, severing the connection between dimensions with an explosion that would supposedly claim Hopper's life. The moment that connection broke, the Mind Flayer's power failed catastrophically. Its flesh monster began to collapse, losing cohesion as the hive mind that sustained it was cut off from its source in the Upside Down. The massive creature that had seemed unstoppable moments before started to dissolve, its form breaking apart, the biomass that comprised it losing the psychic structure that held it together. Within seconds, The monster had been reduced to a puddle of lifeless organic material, steaming and inert on the mall's floor. And Billy Hargrove, free at last from the Mind Flayer's control but mortally wounded, died in his stepsister's arms. His final moments were his own again. His mind returned to him just in time to understand what he had done. He looked at Max, managed to say he was sorry, and then the light went out of his eyes. Billy had finally found redemption in the last moments of his life, had proven that even someone broken by years of abuse, even someone who had spent so long being cruel and violent, could choose to be something better when it truly mattered. His sacrifice wasn't clean or simple. He had hurt too many people, done too many terrible things. But in that final act, he demonstrated that the Mind Flayer's greatest weakness was real. Love, compassion, the memory of being valued as a person, these things could break even the most absolute control. The Mind Flayer was defeated, its presence in Hawkins eliminated, its plans for invasion thwarted. But the victory came at a terrible cost that would echo through the lives of everyone involved. Billy was dead, and Max would carry the guilt and grief of his death into the future, guilt that Vecna would later exploit when choosing his victims. Jim Hopper was gone, supposedly killed in the explosion that destroyed the Russian facility, leaving Eleven without the father figure who had given her a home and a family. Joyce was devastated by the loss of yet another person she cared about, forced to move her family out of Hawkins to try to escape the trauma. And Eleven had lost her powers, the abilities that had made her such an effective defense against the supernatural threats plaguing Hawkins. The fragment the Mind Flayer had left in her leg had done its work, draining her abilities away, leaving her vulnerable and powerless. For a girl whose entire identity had been built around what she could do with her mind, this loss was devastating. She was just Elle now, just a teenage girl without the powers that had defined her since she was born. The Mind Flayer was gone, but it had left devastation in its wake, changing the lives of everyone who had fought against it in ways they would still be processing years later. Yet the story doesn't end there. The Mind Flayer's defeat at Starcourt Mall was not the final chapter in its existence. The truth about the creature's nature, about its relationship to the Upside Down, and to the man who created it, would not be fully revealed until nearly a year later, when Hawkins faced a new threat that seemed, at first, to have nothing to do with the shadow monster that had terrorized the town. In March of 1986, a series of brutal murders began in Hawkins. Teenagers died in their homes, their bodies broken and twisted, their eyes destroyed, killed by some force that seemed to operate from within their own minds. The killings appeared to be the work of something called Vecna, another Dungeons & Dragons monster brought to terrible life. But as the investigation progressed, as the surviving heroes of Hawkins began to uncover the truth, they realized something horrifying. Vecna and the Mind Flayer were connected in ways they had never imagined. The revelation came from Vecna himself. Henry Creel, transformed by years in the Upside Down into something that barely resembled anything human, revealed the truth to Eleven during a psychic confrontation. He had shaped the Mind Flayer, moulded it from particles he found in Dimension X, used it as a tool to extend his consciousness and command the creatures of the Dark Dimension. Every attack the Mind Flayer had launched against Hawkins, every person it had possessed, every horror it had unleashed, all of it had been orchestrated by Henry Creel from his throne in the Upside Down. This revelation recontextualized everything. The Mind Flayer wasn't an independent entity making its own decisions. It was an extension of Vecna's will, a puppet that he controlled, a mask through which he had been working all along. When the Mind Flayer possessed Will Byers, it was really Vecna possessing him, using the shadow creature as an intermediary. When it created the flesh monster, and attacked Starcourt Mall, that too was Vecna's plan, Vecna's strategy. The Mind Flayer was simply the method Vecna used to act in the world while maintaining the safety of distance. Will Byers himself confirmed this understanding. He told his friends that he could still sense Vecna's presence, that the connection he had thought was to the Mind Flayer was actually a connection to Henry Creel. The voice that had spoken in his head during his possession, the alien thoughts that had invaded his consciousness, those had been Vecna's thoughts, Vecna's voice. The Mind Flayer had no independent existence. It was Vecna, and Vecna was the Mind Flayer. But this explanation, compelling as it may be, doesn't entirely account for everything we've observed about the Mind Flayer. The relationship between Vecna and the shadow creature appears more complex, more ambiguous than a simple master-puppet dynamic. Based on what we know from various canonical sources, including of the first Shadow stage play, there's evidence to suggest the Mind Flayer may have been influencing Henry even before he shaped it, that the entity could have had its own goals and used Henry as a vessel just as much as Henry used it. The circular nature of their relationship, where each seems to create and control the other, points towards something far stranger than conventional cause and effect. One interpretation is that Vecna and the Mind Flayer have become so intertwined that they function as a single entity while still retaining some degree of separate identity. In this view, Vecna would provide the intelligence, the strategy, the human understanding necessary to manipulate victims and plan attacks, while the Mind Flayer would provide the raw power, the ability to exist in multiple places simultaneously, the connection to the upside-down's hive mind. Together they could form something greater than either could be alone, a fusion of human malevolence and alien horror. This ambiguity matters because it affects how we understand the threat facing Hawkins. If the Mind Flayer is nothing more than Vecna's puppet, then destroying Vecna should theoretically end the threat entirely. But if the Mind Flayer has some degree of independence, if it can act on its own or even influence Vecna's decisions, then the situation becomes far more complicated. Based on what we've seen, the shadow creature might survive even if Vecna falls, might find a new host or a new way to manifest in the world. The horror could prove more fundamental, more persistent than simply one twisted man and his ambitions. What we can say with certainty is that the Mind Flayer, regardless of its exact relationship to Vecna, represents something primal and terrifying about the Upside Down itself. It embodies the dimension's hostility to human life, its desire to spread and consume, its complete alien nature. Where humans create and build and form communities, the Mind Flayer absorbs and assimilates and destroys individual identity. It represents the ultimate loss of self, the nightmare of being subsumed into something vast and uncaring that uses your body and mind for purposes you can't even understand. The legacy of the Mind Flayer's attacks on Hawkins extends far beyond the immediate physical damage. Will Byers carries psychological scars from his possession that may never fully heal. He flinches at cold temperatures, experiences moments of disconnection when the world around him seems unreal, maintains a connection to Vecna that makes him vulnerable to future attacks. Max Mayfield suffers from crushing guilt over Billy's death, guilt that Vecna later exploited when choosing his victims. Even Eleven, who was never fully possessed, lost her powers after the Mind Flayer's peace bitter, leaving her vulnerable when she needed those abilities most. The Mind Flayer also demonstrated something that made it uniquely dangerous among the threats from the Upside Down. It could plan. Demogorgons operated on instinct, attacking anything that moved or bled. But the Mind Flayer could think ahead, could set traps, could manipulate people using their own emotions and relationships against them. It understood psychology in ways that purely instinctual creatures never could. This made it not just powerful, but insidious, able to work behind the scenes, to corrupt people slowly rather than attacking them outright. The question of what happened to the Mind Flayer after the gate beneath Starcourt closed remains partially unanswered. Its flesh avatar was destroyed, certainly, reduced to inert biomass when the connection to the Upside Down was severed. But the entity itself, the vast shadow that looms in the sky of the dark dimension, presumably still exists. As long as Vecna lives, as long as the Upside Down remains a threat, the Mind Flayer remains a potential danger. It's worth noting that fragments of the Mind Flayer may still exist in the human world, cut off from the main body but not entirely destroyed. The Russians captured at least one piece of the Mind Flayer and stored it in a facility in Kamchatka, keeping it preserved and studying it for potential military applications. This fragment demonstrated that even separated from the hive mind, the Mind Flayer's particles retain some of their properties, some of their terrible potential. If someone were to reopen a gate, if the connection were re-established, these fragments could theoretically awaken and resume their mission of assimilation and destruction. The Mind Flayer also revealed something crucial about how the Upside Down appears to function. It's not just a place, it seems to operate as an organism. The hive mind that connects all the creatures and growths in that dimension means that attacking one part affects the whole. Burning the tunnels hurt Will when he was possessed, because the tunnels were part of the same vast entity that inhabited him. Based on what we've observed, the Mind Flayer doesn't simply command the Upside Down, it appears to be the Upside Down, at least in terms of its consciousness and will. Every vine, every demogorgon, every spore and tendril seems to be part of one enormous, distributed intelligence. This understanding completely changes how we think about the threat. You can't simply kill the Mind Flayer, because it doesn't have a single body that can be killed. You would have to destroy every particle, every creature, every bit of growth in the entire Upside Down, and even then, as long as Vecna lives, he could potentially rebuild it. The Mind Flayer is less a creature and more a force, a fundamental aspect of how the dark dimension operates. The strategic implications of this are profound. Every battle against the Upside Down appears to be ultimately a battle against the Mind Flayer, even when it doesn't directly appear. When demobats attack in swarms, that seems to be the Mind Flayer's strategy. When vines strangle and constrict, that appears to be the Mind Flayer's grip. The shadow creature functions as the nervous system of the entire dimension, carrying commands from Vecna to every corner of his dark kingdom. Based on what we understand about the hive mind, you can't fight the Upside Down without fighting the Mind Flayer, and you can't defeat the Mind Flayer without addressing Vecna himself. This brings us to the present situation, to the state of affairs as Hawkins faces its greatest crisis yet. Vecna has created multiple gates through his murders, and the Upside Down is bleeding into the human world more extensively than ever before. The barriers between dimensions are weakening, and based on past patterns, the Mind Flayer likely stands ready to take advantage of this opportunity. Its previous attacks could be interpreted as probing strikes, tests of human defences, learning experiences that taught it how to better assault its enemies. If Vecna succeeds in fully merging the dimensions, the Mind Flayer would potentially have free rein to spread throughout the entire world, possessing humanity on a scale that makes the Flayed of 1985 look like a small-scale rehearsal. Will Byers' continued connection to Vecna means he can sense the Mind Flayer's presence, can feel when it's active or planning something. This connection is both a vulnerability and a potential advantage. Based on how the hive mind works, Vecna could potentially use it to track Will's location or influence his thoughts. But it also means that Will might be able to sense the Mind Flayer's plans, might serve as an early warning system for future attacks. The question is whether that connection can be exploited without putting Will in danger, without giving Vecna an opening to possess him once again. The methods that worked against the Mind Flayer in the past, heat and severing the connection between dimensions, may not be sufficient for future encounters. The entity has demonstrated an ability to adapt, to learn from its failures. If it attacks again, it seems reasonable to expect that it will have developed countermeasures against the tactics that defeated it before. The heroes of Hawkins will need new strategies, new weapons, new ways of thinking about how to fight something that exists simultaneously as a physical presence and a psychic force. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Mind Flayer's rise and fall is that its greatest weakness isn't physical at all. Looking at both major defeats, the victory came through emotional connection. Will resisted possession because his friends and family refused to give up on him, because they reminded him of who he was and anchored him to his own identity. Billy broke free from the Mind Flayer's control because Eleven showed him compassion, because she reminded him that he was capable of being something other than what trauma had made him. The Mind Flayer represents the obliteration of individual identity, the subsumation of the self into a vast, uncaring collective. But love, genuine human connection, the refusal to abandon someone even when they've been taken over by darkness, these things create a foundation that the Mind Flayer struggles to destroy. There appears to be something about human emotional bonds that resists the hive mind, that maintains identity even when the Mind Flayer tries to erase it. This pattern suggests that the ultimate weapon against the shadow creature isn't fire or telekinesis or sealed gates, though all of those help. The ultimate weapon may be the stubborn human insistence that individuals matter, that we are more than interchangeable parts in a larger machine. The Mind Flayer sought to remake the world according to Vecna's vision, to create a reality where humans were prey, where individual consciousness was subsumed into the collective, where Henry Creel's nihilistic philosophy became the organizing principle of existence. It came terrifyingly close to succeeding, demonstrating power and intelligence that made it one of the most formidable antagonists in any story of cosmic horror. But it was defeated twice by people who refused to accept that victory was impossible, who fought back even when the odds seemed overwhelming, who believed that one person's life, whether that person was Will Byers or Billy Hargrove, was worth fighting for. The Mind Flayer may not be truly gone. As long as Vecna lives, as long as the Upside Down exists, the shadow creature looms as a potential threat. But its defeats have shown that it can be beaten, that for all its vast power and alien intelligence, it's vulnerable to the very human qualities it seems to despise. Hope, courage, love, the willingness to sacrifice for others, these things create a kind of armour that the Mind Flayer's tendrils can't quite penetrate. Understanding the Mind Flayer, its origins, its nature, its connection to Vecna, and its methods of attack, provides crucial context for everything that has happened in Hawkins since that first gate opened in 1983. It reveals that the various threats that seemed separate, the Demogorgon, the Demodogs, the Possession, the Flayed, were all manifestations of a single terrible intelligence working toward a singular goal. Every horror was connected. Every attack was part of a larger plan. And the shadow that loomed over Hawkins was not just a monster, but the physical embodiment of one man's hatred for humanity itself. As the story moves forward, as Hawkins faces new threats and old enemies return in new forms, the lessons learned from fighting the Mind Flayer will undoubtedly prove essential. The creature demonstrated that the Upside Down isn't just a place or a collection of monsters. It's a unified force, a single vast organism with intelligence and purpose. Defeating it will require more than just closing gates or fighting individual creatures. It will require confronting the consciousness at the heart of it all, the twisted union of Henry Creel and the shadow he shaped, the monster that calls itself the Mind Flayer. The rise of the A's Mind Flayer showed how quickly and completely an alien intelligence could infiltrate and corrupt a community. Its fall demonstrated that even something as powerful and terrifying as a hive mind spanning dimensions could be resisted by people willing to stand together. And its continued existence, lurking in the Upside Down and waiting for its next opportunity, serves as a reminder that the fight isn't over. The shadow still waits in the darkness, patient and vast and hungry, ready to engulf anyone who drops their guard, even for a moment. So if you found yourself diving deep into the shadow with us today, if you've enjoyed unravelling the mysteries of the Mind Flayer and understanding what makes this creature one of the most compelling and terrifying antagonists in modern fiction, do me a favour. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the lore and mythology of your favourite stories, and let me know in the comments what aspect of the Mind Flayer's story you found most fascinating. Was it the psychological horror of possession? The tragic story of Billy's redemption? The revelation about Vecna's connection to it all? I read every comment, and your insights often point me toward topics for future videos. Until next time, stay curious, stay analytical, and remember that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones we can see, but the ones that make us question where we end and something else begins. Sweet dreams, and may your mind always remain your own.